So the world is shape-shifting. If you look at studies done by BCG and Bain, they looked at volatility indexes. If you just look at quantify volatility, this index is growing steadily. So it's a matter of survival.
Welcome to the Product Quest podcast. Thank you for joining us on our journey to better understand innovation and product strategy. My name is Jan Wermuth, and joining me as always, my two co-hosts, Jonathan Edwards and Scott Burleson. Today, we talk about one of those shiny words in business that many talk about, yet few really understand, and that word is scaling. So many businesses are looking for business models that can scale, yet very few succeed. Today is all about scaling a new business building with our guest, Frank Mattes, and his approach and also the company called Lean Scaleup. But before we jump in, let me just say that it's always inspiring to talk to Frank, and I'm talking from experience here. He's a great guy to work with and think with. So he brings the experience, the thoughtfulness, and the energy and momentum to make great things happen, all in one person. So Frank, welcome to the Product Quest podcast.
Thanks for having me, Scott, Jan, and Jonathan.
Well, let's jump in. So for those of you who don't know you, like, who is Frank Mattes?
Oh, I can speak about a couple of years on that. Probably it would not be good enough. So to make a long story short, I've spent more than 2 decades now in what they call these days innovation. When I started off, they had the term was non-existent back then. They called it new product development. And so I went through what that means in practice. I started off with innovation is a project, and you assemble the team members and came up with a project plan. Then later on, when I was with the Boston Consulting Group, we had those wallpapers, 250 steps in new product development, take all the risks, and we went into portfolio management. Some around 2010 or so, I got interested in the more out-of-the-box thing, right? Open innovation was the buzzword of the day. And then some 5 years ago, I noticed that there is a big unsolved question in corporate innovation, which is how can we turn these fancy, great, game-changing ideas into cold hard cash and into corporate transformation. And at that time, 5 years ago, there was nothing out there, Jan. How do we do that? There was no blueprint, no recipe, no kind of framework, etc. And so what I did, and this is where this story of the Lean Scale-Up begins, I assembled a group of some 20 companies, a couple of leading global business schools, and we put our heads together, the wisdom of the crowd, if you will, and try to understand why is it so hard for corporates to break out of the mold, if you will, to build new businesses in parallel to the existing business. And here we are, some 5 years later. There's a book out there. There's a huge community out there that is adopting that kind of framework. There are some 40 or 50 companies that took up bits and pieces of that framework, and we're making good progress, and we're on the way to help the corporate practitioners solve that big problem for their respective companies.
So it's a book I can really recommend. So I by the way, I love how you kind of approach this, just as the collaborative approach that you bring to your books, I should say. So there is a second one that you're working on right now, and we'll get into all of the nice little details. But I just love the approach of bringing the people together. I think there is a kind of a list of 40 to 50 authors in the end that really kind of helped or supported in writing the whole approach in the book. And I mean, if anything is customer focused, then co-creation, right? So I really like this about how you develop this.
And the book is Lean Scaleup, just to mention.
The book is Lean Scaleup, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Coming out, I'm not sure on the subtitle, the second or revised and extended edition or the 2023 edition, with the intention of coming up with a yearly update and absorbing the best practices and the case studies that show the practitioners how to crack the code in there. So, but Jan, actually, it's more than 100 now on the co-author list.
Oh, wow.
More than 100. Some 70, 80 practitioners, and then some 20 or so folks from academia. One thing that I learned when I was in pre-Lean Scaleup, but still open innovation times, is 99% of the smart people don't work for your company. There's a lot of smart people out there, right? And it's about making the distinctions, or it's about finding the words that resonate, that ring a bell, right? And this is where the interaction and the co-creation comes into play.
Yeah, I remember so well the first time I heard you speak, and just the name Lean Scale Up is like, if it immediately catches, and I think you immediately latch on and you see the problem behind it and you see why that approach is needed. So I think a lot of this is really about the words, and we'll get into a couple of beautiful words later on. But can you just give kind of a glimpse of what is Lean Scale Up? What is it that you do? What is the approach? Just so we have a kind of a general overview of the process.
Mm-hmm. What we found out some 5 years ago, and we got the confirmation all along the way, and more distinctions and a better language along the way, is that the root cause why it is so hard for companies to build new businesses in parallel to the existing one is a system problem, right? Under one corporate roof, you have two systems. The one system is designed to execute a proven business model, right? Today's day-to-day business. You've got your customers and the value proposition and the products and the services that deliver that value proposition. You have your channels to reach the customers. Unfortunately, your usual suspects, your competitors, have the same ideas, right? So you're battling with them on revenues and margins in here. And this is a system that has been fine-tuned for decades, right? And obviously there are companies out there that are more than 100, 200 years old. They're finally tuned and polished that approach that they have in here. They've got the processes, they've got the IT systems, they know how to run the show, the work together, collaborate, and run these processes, and know you stick to the rules if you want to have success in that, and you look for that quarterly and annual figures that you need to meet in there. And you basically keep on repeating that same old success recipe. That's the one system. The other system is the search for new value pools, the search for a new business model that you can build to seize and capture the value in here. And as some people had called them, the blue oceans, right? Where there's initially at least little competition in here, and hence you can grow like crazy, and you can really build new businesses, new revenue streams, and also corporate transformation. If you think about, for instance, one of my clients, BP, transforming from an oil and gas company to an energy company in 10 years or so, right? So this is what you do. And in that second system, you think long-term, you think agile, build, test, measure, learn, repeat, right? You think about exploring the unknown and the way to reduce the uncertainty with a scientific approach, saying these are our hypotheses, this is what we want to test, and this is what came out of the test, and hence we conclude and move forward. The whole idea of an experiment, you cannot find in the first system that I mentioned, right? They don't know the word, they execute, right? And so we find that these two systems, they belong together. They future-proof the company, if you will, in the now, but also in the new, right? That the explorers want to find in here. But I hope the points, and there are many more to make that I mentioned, make it clear that these two systems are not compatible.
Yeah.
So if your ambition is to future-proof the company, right, to win the now, but also to create the new and to win in the new that you're building, well, you need to find a way to make these two systems work together. by default, the day-to-day business will always win, right? Because this is the home turf of the people that work in here. They know how to run the show, and this is where you get the successes, at least the short-term successes, right? So how do you balance that two stuff? And it turns out, and I'm now turning around the corner, and I know that was a long speech, turns out that you need a system solution to connect these two systems. And this system solution consists of three cogwheels, if you will. The one is leadership, the second one is methodology and process, and the third one is people, culture, collaboration, right? And if you take it and the essential aspects from these cogwheels, you can actually make these two systems talk together, work together in a productive way, and hence balance now and new and future-proof the company.
Yeah. So maybe just to clarify, so it's the three cogwheels are so it's culture, method, and leadership. Is that correct? Leadership. So these three things have to be balanced. I also like how you emphasize, and maybe we should go into that a little bit. That you emphasize that it's a system. So it's really aimed also, is that fair to say that the approach that you have, so Lean Scaleup, is aimed at corporates? So how can you basically do scale up as a corporate or in a corporate context, and kind of a startup would be a different story, or how do you see this?
Perfectly right. I mean, if you're a greenfield startup, as I like to call them, right? Three of us or the four of us getting together have a brilliant idea, then we find a VC that backs up, and off we go for the races, right? You can almost get by with some qualifications, with some new ideas on the lean startup and some additional concepts like growth hacking and that kind of stuff. And obviously, there's a lot of theory and that was developed in the last year or 2 years or so on how to get the product right, which is an art in itself. The way that I see it, Jan, is if you look at the stats from CB Insights, for instance, right, the reasons why startups fail, right, and they did not find product market fit, they ran out of money, and the timing was not right, etc., that kind of stuff. You can check this for greenfield startups. You can check it as well for corporate startups. But corporate startups have an additional complexity, right? It's not just a financial play. Right, you may know that stories from Twitter, for instance, or Slack that originally were designed for different purposes, and then they found something that caught their interest and pivoted and made a huge success. That's not how corporate innovation works, right? In corporate innovation, you always also have to have a kind of strategic component to that, right? You're doing innovation because you want to have that kind of transformational play, etc., in here. Yeah. So I would say the Lean Scale-Up was explicitly designed for that corporate context. If you're a greenfield startup, well, there's a couple of things that you can learn from it. But I would recommend, if you're a greenfield startup, you rather go for that lean startup kind of school in here with some additional elements on that.
Yeah. I really like this kind of the targeted way of your approach. And there is a couple of really additional challenges in a corporate context. You named them. So the balancing of now and new and just corporates are more process-oriented beasts and more established kinds of things. So you have to manage that as well. I would love to go into a little bit these cogwheels, so leadership, method, and culture. So what behind it is it, or what are these leadership, method, and culture kind of things? How would you do a leadership in the Lean Scale-Up way, or what would that entail?
Mm-hmm. So I mean, obviously there's a lot of stuff in here, and some of the stuff qualifies for particular industries more than it does for others, and the size of the company and its position in the industry. All these play a role in here. But see, what will come out of the second book is to say, well, if you want to be excellent in building new businesses on the side of existing ones, there are 12 success factors, right? And we will highlight these 12 success factors with extensive case studies. So there are half a dozen or so case studies in here that basically provide the proof points, if you will, that these are the relevant factors. Now, if we start with leadership, all of these three, the leadership, the process methodology, and the culture, people, collaboration piece, they have four major aspects right in here. So if we start with leadership, I would say it's leadership job number one to future-proof the company, right? To win the now, but also make sure that the company will still be around in 5 or 10 years and will still be successful then. So one of the first things that I would I see as a crucial success factor in winning that new business building game is the ambition for the new and the alignment more on the formal side in here of the now and the new. So ambition means obviously you are a leader, you're C-suite members that is not simply satisfied with the way things are, right? Because you think out of the box, you think 5 years or 10 years into the future, right? Yeah. It depends obviously on the clock speed of the industry that you're working in. So if you're, for instance, in the energy business, if you're a company like BP, there's a huge mega trends, decarbonization, net zero, you know that stuff, Jan, right? So obviously the ambition is there. If you're in the automotive industry, switching to mobility and people don't buy cars anymore, they rent mobility and that kind of stuff. If you do not have the ambition for the new, you're on the wrong place there, right?
You have an issue in a couple of years.
Yeah. But there are some industries where you have rather a slow clock speed, right? So it might be different there, right? But then we come already to the first breakpoint, if you will, the aligning of the now and the new. And this at the core is a problem of resource allocation, right? And it's not just the monetary resources that you allocate. Let me put it bluntly, in most situations, money is not the real problem, right? Because there's so much also venture capital flowing around that at the end of the day, you can basically partner with these kind of companies to fund what you think would be a game changer in here. The real problems in many cases is people, right? Because the experts, the go-to people, etc., they can either do the job in their existing business, right? Or they can play a part in creating this new stuff in here. Yeah. When you embark on the journey, you then run into the problem. How do you basically manage to companies, let's put it that way, an established company where 99% of the people work in, right, delivering the day-to-day business, and you have 1% creating the new, etc. And it turns out that these two companies under one roof, they have different performance management systems, right? On the one side, the day-to-day business, you have clear-cut second decimal kind of controlling procedures, whereas on the other side, you have
market share gains of 0 point, I don't know.
Exactly, and EBITDA and EBITDA 2 and then all these kind of constructs that simply do not make sense in emerging business opportunity. Then obviously there's one more thing to that, which is the one company mindset, as I say. There's a famous story of Kodak. I guess every innovator knows that, but there's a lesser known story about Fujifilm. And Fujifilm, same business, same company size, if you measure it on a global market share, same challenge. Well, the one company went bankrupt. The other one is now worth 20 times more than Kodak. Why? Because it learned how to build new businesses, right? And when you follow the story, and I did the research for the upcoming book, the CEO was so much into taking the people along, which Kodak did not manage. That's the deeper reason why they failed, right? Mm-hmm. They said it's a one company that we're having, today's company, and what we are creating for tomorrow. We are not quite sure what we're creating. We don't have the identity. But here's the trick. We're not in the film business. We're in the surface chemistry business. And let's leverage the technologies that we have to create those new businesses, right? Yeah. So it's also that aspect. It's one company, and there's a lot of conversation. This is not just 5 slides. This is tons of conversations and basically what I call the soul of the company, right? Whereas the alignment is more the formal part that you need to arrange.
Yeah, and I mean, that's something we experience quite often. Well, not the one company, but rather the, I don't know, multiple company, or where you even have kind of incentive systems within the company and they work in different ways, and they're not well, maybe a question here, kind of a follow-up question. How, I mean, you need kind of leadership needs to kind of formulate a kind of vision to get where they want to go to, or is it also okay to say, hey, we just want to start the transformation, we don't know exactly where it's going? So how clear does leadership need to be in order to take the people along?
As clear as possible, I would say, Jan. But the experience from Mr. Komori, that was his name, from Fujifilm, shows it might not be very clear in the beginning. Right? Yeah. So you have that general idea. Let's use the technology that we master in surface chemistry, and you need that in cosmetics industry. You need that as well as if you think about packaging for electronic materials and all the other businesses that they build, right? So how do you construct a vision in here, right? So I mean, the way that this role model for new business building was to say, well, we define ourselves by our core competences. But then again, you also need to think about what are the capabilities, the new competences that you need to build. For instance, one of my clients is a medtech company, right? They used to sell MRT scanners to hospitals. And now they've got the idea that they want to basically come up with a diagnostics as a business, quote unquote, diagnostics as a service business. Sorry about that. So you get the patients into the MRT scanner, you get the images, then you have clever AI that analyzes the images and prescribes a therapy, right, for that patient. Well, it turns out if you want to build such a business, there's a lot of things that you need to learn that differs from shipping boxes, right? The MRT scanners in the past, right? It's a service culture. It's how to set and manage service levels, how to invoice, that kind of stuff, how to make yourself attractive for top talent, how do you win the mainstream customers, right? The first customer is usually not the problem. The 10th customer or the 100th customer, that's the problem. Yeah. So, and this is the kind of the mix that you need to build, right? How do we define ourselves from these core capabilities, and what are the things that we need to learn? Because as Jeff Bezos said, if you define yourself only by the core competences, if you limit yourself, well, you do not have a right to exist if the world changes, the VUCA stuff, right? Yeah.
Yeah. This what you're talking about, and the Fuji story you told us reminds me a lot of Sarasvati's effectuation theory. About how, where she describes the entrepreneurial way of making decisions, where basically you're always trying to figure out what's the next best step. And instead of setting a goal and trying to reach it, you start with where you are currently now, what you have, what your strengths are, etc. And think about what can you possibly do? What are the potentialities that are available to you starting from your current position? And it's I think that's quite it just reminded me of that when you talked about Fuji. I don't know if you aware of this this theory, or if you think it. Yep.
Yes, I am. Two points on that, Jonathan. Number one is Jeff Bezos coined the term one-way decisions or two-way decisions, right? So if you're moving ahead, you need to be very clear in which decisions that you're taking could be reversed and which decisions are not reversible, right? So what you want to do in a corporate context, you give the teams the freedom, you empower them to do the reversible decisions, right? The two-way door decisions, right? Yeah. But you want to be, as a governance board, be very much involved, and you want to have the data from the experiments that show you clearly what to do when it comes to one-way door decisions. And the second is, Jonathan, there's also a scientific theory behind why this is the best approach. I mean, so many people say, well, the Lean Startup that basically came out of nowhere, right? There was Steve Blank, Stanford University, 4 Steps to Epiphany, customer development. And then his students, Eric Ries, said, well, we can apply the same principle to build products. And that was the Lean Startup. But actually, in the 90s, there was a scientific study commissioned by IBM, and there were dozens really of scientists involved from all angles in here. And the headline question was, what is the best approach to move to progress in different environmental situations, right? And it turns out that, for instance, the day-to-day business that companies are in, these are kind of simple situations, right? You know, if you hit that button, then the light bulb goes on at the other corner of the room, right? And hence that process-driven execution of a proven success recipe, if you will, right? That's the right way to move ahead and make progress in that situation. However, if you're trying to find new value pools, if you're trying to find new business models, you're in an environment that you cannot even grasp. You do not know the knowns and the unknowns out there and what else is there. And hence the so-called Cinefin framework that was coming out of that IBM study clearly says that this kind of effectuation, or that build, test, measure, learn, repeat, or agile, or whatever you want to call it, that's the best way, the most effective way to move ahead in these kind of situations.
Yeah, I think the Cinefin or Kinevin or whatever, however it's pronounced, it's a very interesting approach. And what I like about it is this idea that you have to recognize in which space you are. So, if I recall, they'll basically identify 4 different types of situations, if they're complex or it always changes, so I don't quite remember now exactly. Chaotic, complex, complicated, something like this.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, for instance, I think they recommend that an agile type approach you would do in what they call kind of an in-between space, a liminal space, or something in between two. And so the idea is that you if you identify where you're at in this space, you will use a different kind of technique. And I have to say, I find that quite an interesting idea. And I don't really know where I was going with that, but anyway, that's
it's interesting. I mean, if you're a car maker, Jonathan, right, and you have those cars then come up down the production line, right? You don't do the build, test, measure, learn kind of stuff, right? You have your Six Sigma quality system, and everything is set up so that you can deliver that kind of quality that is asked for. Right?
Yeah. I think these are really
the difference between those two systems that we talked about earlier, right?
Yeah. I think this also goes back to the thing you mentioned very in the beginning. It's you cannot apply the same kind of KPIs or measures or however. I mean, progress just looks different. I mean, in this more red space, let's say, where you know where you are, that's you know like efficiency is key, and you know how you can measure this. In the other part, it's not that clear. It's not even that clear if efficiency is a value in itself. So it's different kinds of ways you basically need to measure it. But how can you then, I mean, chaotic, new situation, different kind of approach. But what then are some of the elements, let's say, that you can follow. I mean, you need kind of a process, still you need kind of a way to approach this, and how does that connect to the overall Lean Scaleup thing? So if you could go into a little bit more this approach, because maybe a second question in between is, one thing is leadership, one thing is people, but it's also a problem to where's the opportunity? Just in how do you find really the opportunity in there is money there, I agree, but where's the opportunity really? I think that is also a question that kind of needs to be answered, right?
Well, these were a couple of aspects.
Yeah.
Let's take them one by one. I mean, if we put ourselves into the helicopter and look at what's going on in these two systems, right? You mentioned the red shirt system, right? The people in the day-to-day business working in the red oceans, right? Battling with the usual suspects for every euro in revenues and every cent in margin, right? And the other one, we call them the blue shirts, right? Because
I love this, the red shirts and the blue shirts.
So if we get into the helicopter and look at these two fractions, the red shirts and the blue shirts operating, there's a fundamental difference between those two, and it's more than just semantics. The blue shirts, they are operating in the world of uncertainty. Whereas the red shirts, they are working in a kind of world that is predictable, or at least has risks that you can quantify and arrange yourself in a way that you can basically eliminate or minimize these kind of risks, if you will. Right? But there's a fundamental difference between uncertainty and risk. Uncertainty means you don't know what you're dealing with, right? Yeah. And hence you need to systematically reduce this uncertainty, systematically look for what is our biggest assumption and how could we validate or falsify that assumption. Right? This is really a scientific progress. And I think that's also one aspect that is coming much too short when I visit companies and I'm dealing with the red shirts and the blue shirts and typically the red shirts that fund that blue shirt party, right? By the way, right?
Yeah, which doesn't help in the relationship, but
they think it's chaotic, but if you do it right, it's not chaotic at all. It's right. It's scientific exploration. It's like Thomas Alva Edison had his 10,000 experiments before he created the light bulb, right? And you all know that famous quote, I discovered one more way that doesn't work, right? And at the end, he found the source that helped to create General Electric out of that, right? We know that story, right? So it's the systematic reduction of uncertainty, and hence it's one of the biggest mistakes that you can do. Come up with a business plan, the Excel sheet, right? And you find the numbers, and typically you find the hockey sticks, right? Next 1 to 2 years would be tough. In 5 years, we will be filthy rich, etc. Because what these kind of Excel diagrams do not show is the set of assumptions that is behind that. Yeah. And actually, I mean, when I'm working with stakeholders of corporate startups or scale-ups when they enter the scaling up phase, I recommend to put them under extreme time pressure and also to underfund them. So the team comes up to the stakeholder, says, well, we looked at it, and for the next 9 months, we need 2.5 million, right? Because we need to do this.
And
we need
please.
to do that. Yeah. So I would recommend my stakeholders to say, well, give them 7 months and give them 80% of what they asked for.
Ooh.
Why? Focus, focus, focus. It really urges, it recommends, it requires, or whatever word you want to use, the team to say, what is the most critical assumption that we need to look at it, right? And then you basically set up your experiment and then you let the data speak, right? And then that's a kind of mindset, and obviously it depends on the corporate culture if you want to follow that recommendation or not, right?
No, but I love this. I mean, this is also you as a person have this mindset, like this heavy focus, and which really helps because companies, well, it's very natural, I think, in this uncertain space, in this innovation space, you can get lost in 1,000 different options. There's so many things that you can find out and look at, and it's never a shortage of ideas or things we could also have a look at. But really, this insistence on focus, I really like this about the approach, and I must say. And maybe a second thing to add is I also really like the way you use the word experiment. So the systematic reduction of assumptions or of risk, let's say. And I think the word experiment gets a bad treat in the innovation space, where it's rather associated with experiments are, well, let's do this, let's do that, and see what happens, and maybe something works and maybe something doesn't. And so it has this play, but I don't think that's not what an experiment is. An experiment is a very controlled thing. You know exactly kind of what you're testing against, and then you're testing exactly for that effect. So I like this scientific mindset, if you, or even wording that you bring to it, where, because it's not about having fun. Let's say, well, it's okay if it is fun, but in the end, it's about, like, where do the returns from tomorrow come from? And that's a different kind of question than just exploring some kind of. Yeah, I want to just to add this. I really like this.
Yeah, and in the upcoming book, Jan, there's also a case study that's corporate startup of a very large container shipping company, right? And the team there, the blue shirts, if you will, they were dabbling around for a couple of years, and they did this and explored that,
exactly.
etc. But then after 4 years, their governance board said, guys, we will control alt delete, right? We will now set you on this target segment where we're not good at, and try to find a business model. What we bring to the table is extensive access to our corporate assets and capabilities.
Yeah.
But in turn, we require from you to steer clear of all the other opportunities. And the CEO of that startup said that was kind of really opened up the door and freed us from limitless degrees of freedom and focus on just one thing.
Yeah.
There's one more thing, Jan, into that, where so first of all, it's the right understanding of experiments. But the second big question comes along with that immediately is, when do you stop experimenting? So you run your experiments, you collect the data, and it looks promising and that kind of stuff. So when do you basically put the check mark on and say, okay, now we can move on, right? We've tested that there's a real customer problem and there's willingness to pay, right? And we think that a freemium model, just an example, obviously, what we're discussing, would be the right way to go. And we also identified the price point. Now let's work on the go-to-market strategy. So when exactly is that point?
Yeah.
And here's an interesting also observation that I made along the way, and it circulates around the term learning. The typical blue shirt, I'm wearing a blue shirt right now.
On brand.
You cannot see it, but it's true. I'm wearing a blue shirt. Right. And it's also, I think, the task of the blue shirts to nudge the red shirts to get the system right, so that innovation can scale in that company, right? By definition, by the setup, the company is not set up for innovation to scale. Right, it's set up for relentless execution of that proven business model, etc. But coming back to the point that I just wanted to make is, when do you did enough experimenting? And the answer to that centers around the word learning, and which ties into that uncertainty discussion we had a few minutes ago. You know that you have learned enough. In other words, you can stop experimenting. Take this as a foundation, build your house on, move on, etc. When you can predict the outcomes of experiments, right? When you basically have, in other words, enough insight, then you say, okay, if I put an A/B test up, right, and looking for consumers to take the left door or the right door, I predict that 66%, 2/3 will take the left door. Right, so it's if it's 65 or 67, that's not the real deal, right? But when you can make these kind of claims in advance, you learned enough to put the bits and pieces that make up the business model and the operating model and the people that you need and the organization that you need to build and the products you need, etc., strong enough. So actually, and I'm just using that example, Jan, to show that there is a really body of knowledge emerging on how companies can crack the code and beat the odds. We haven't spoken about the odds, right? If you were a corporate practitioner, right, and you launch a corporate startup today, how high is the chance that you get a $50 million business annual revenue?
I know it's terrible. It's terribly low.
It's 3%. 3%. So that means 29 out of 30 corporate startups will fail, right? And you arrive at that figure if you basically multiply certain stats that are out there delivered by large consulting companies. So I think we can work with these figures.
Yeah.
I have a question, and I hope I can frame it correctly. Basically, I kind of wonder how should the role of the corporate entity be different to, say, an investor or venture capitalist with regards to these companies inside? Because one thing I always wondered is, if you look at this as a portfolio kind of approach and you say, okay, I have this team developing this team developing this. As you said at the beginning, I mean, there are many smart people all over, and most of them are probably not in your company. So if there must be some difference in between, let's say, a venture capital firm and the role that the corporate company plays, because otherwise you might argue that really what a company should do is in fact just have existing businesses and look around like a venture capitalist and find new companies and buy them. Now, of course, many companies also do that, such as Facebook, etc. I mean, a lot of companies buying other companies, but companies also do innovate within themselves, within the company itself. And I kind of wonder how is that different? I mean, why is it an advantage to innovate within your company at all?
First of all, it's a pure necessity, right? So if you're a horse carriage maker, right, there are only so many in the world today, right? Because at some point the consumer said, well, we'd like to have the things that they called automobiles, right? We're not so much into horse carriages anymore, right? So the world is changing. Think about technological changes, ChatGPT as one example. Digital helps companies to blur historic industry boundaries, right? And you find that suddenly an insurance company is battling as a player in the IoT market, Munich Re and some acquisitions that they made, etc. So the world is shape-shifting, and if you look at studies done by BCG and Bain, also they looked at volatility indexes, right? So if you try to quantify volatility, you find that this index is growing steadily. So it's a matter of survival to test what is possible and to build new businesses that play into a changing environment. So, Jonathan, the big point is that, or the big difference between a corporate investor and a kind of external VC is that the company, in its decades, centuries of existence, has built up corporate assets and capabilities, right? And at the very superficial level, you can count customers, brand name, channels, partners, tons of experts, etc. onto that. In the book, you will find a checklist because, for instance, another asset is operational data that you can use to train AI models. Right? And if you're a greenfield startup, if you and I would set up a startup, we don't have that real life transactional data in here. So that's one of the difference. What I envision or what I advise my clients is also to take a portfolio approach, right? To say, well, we can debate behind our desks, behind our computer screens in virtual conferences for days and weeks if this is a good idea or if it's not a good idea. It turns out nobody can pick the winners, but You can nail down, as we discussed earlier, the most critical, the most crucial assumptions, and then we put it to the test. And then reciting Jeff Bezos again, he once said, I'm not the master decision maker at Amazon. I encourage people to come up with effective, cheap, rapid experiments, and then we let the data speak. Then we look at what the data tells us about the nature of the world outside. But there are similarities in here between a VC approach and a corporate investor approach. There are also peculiarities in here, right? So as a corporate investor, as a corporate business builder, you would always look at that transformational element, right? Whereas if you're looking at the greenfield VC situation, well, you would play a valuation game, building up valuation, and you would acquire other companies, you would pivot as long as it makes sense. So there's an overlap. It's a Venn diagram, Jonathan.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that so let's say corporate startups, let's to call them something, will have an unfair advantage relative to a greenfield startup if because they have access to assets and knowledge that maybe others wouldn't have access to. Is I guess that's that makes sense. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but there's a dirty little secret, Jonathan. They have a theoretical unfair advantage. See, the dirty little secret is that you do have those assets and capabilities, but that they are right-sized for the day-to-day business, and their access is controlled so that it makes sense in that process-driven, short-term, day-to-day business. So if a company does not solve that, if we do not build up that gearbox with leadership and methodology, process, and people, culture, collaboration in place, they do not have that advantage. So they might lose out on the theoretical side, being bogged down by corporate bureaucracy, while still fighting outside in the marketplace against greenfield startups, VC-backed greenfield startups, and corporate startups from the usual suspects, the competitors. So in essence, as Steve Blank has called it, they fight a two-front war, right? The internal plus the external.
Yeah.
So this is really make or break to get that system solution in place that connects the red shirt system and the blue shirt system.
Yeah. Like there is a natural tendency between the two. There is just, I mean, it's probably the blue shirt, no, the red shirts are quite protective of what they have and the assets that they have. And that's a cultural shift, mindset shift, all that kind of stuff to just enable the blue shirts to be successful as well. I think that is kind of, or it needs to somehow, you need to manage that kind of relationship.
Exactly, and this is where the leadership part kicks in, as we discussed earlier. Exactly, this is the pain point where it hurts, right? This is where you need to leadership support to balance the now and the new.
Yeah. Is there also, sorry, Scott, do you want to?
Yeah, I don't know if this goes in with the flow. I tell you the question that just, I mean, it just makes complete sense to me, the blue system, the red system. In fact, I even like the clarity of those teams and the shirts. So maybe you can even have identities. I'm a fan of Blue Ocean strategy, so I like the clarity of that. It makes conversation very efficient. The thing that I wonder about, I find myself just thinking through real clients that I've met with, and you met with the leadership, and so many of these conversations are very identical from what they say. And this is what they say. They say, well, everything we make, it's all incremental. And, you know, we can't seem to make, you know, we can't seem to anticipate big changes. And, you know, we're fighting for our life and we're worried about a recession. And in other words, all their concerns are very red shirtish, if you will. Their concerns are the next 6 months to a year. But but to a person, almost everyone complains about being too incremental, and also about, wow, it just takes us too long to build new products. So they sort of have this very common list of suggestions. So where my brain is, and I know the things that I've sort of said to them, but like just real practically and tactically, what's our, if we want to bring in a blue shirt team or approach, what does our next year look like for that leader that wants to sort of get off this incremental hamster wheel?
Mm. Scott, there's a sub question in here which is very foundational to address. The question is, how far do you want to jump? Right?
Yeah.
So if you imagine that you would draw up a portfolio, right? On the one axis, you put customers' business model, right? Let's imagine that's the x-axis, right? And on the y-axis, you put technologies and compatible capabilities, right? And you cut both axes into existent, we know that stuff, adjacent or far out, right? So if you're in that segment with far out technologies, far out capabilities, new customers, new business models, the question is really how good can you dock this to the existing core? And there might be really a stretch, even if a leader is fully aware to take his organization along. Mr. Fujifilm could do it because he was on a burning platform, right? He said, guys, if we do not do that in 10 years, our story is over, right? We need to run fast, right? Most of the clients that I work with, and I assume also, Scott, your clients, they're not on a burning platform. Yes, the environment is changing. Could be that digital plays a new role in 10 years, but 10 years is far out. These kind of thoughts in here, right? So if you want to dock this, it's kind of hard. Let me also give you a practical example. I spoke about that MedTech company a few minutes ago, right? So diagnostics as a service, and they had half a dozen or so corporate startups, right? And every single corporate startup ran against the same brick wall. And they were wondering why they did not make any progress in these new business models. So what was the brick wall? Well, the accounting procedures and also the accounting systems that the company was using, the accounting philosophies, if you will, right? That was all about shipping boxes, creating products, shipping boxes, get the money, get the revenue per box shipped.
Send the bill, get the money.
Exactly. And now you come along, Scott, and you say, well, we need to have a service subscription-based business model. They were not able to process that, right? And if you then speak with these senior leaders in the financial and in the controlling areas, well, they need to convince the shareholders that the revenue will not be growing. There will be a dip, right? Because that's how things materialize. And at the end of the tunnel, you will have customer lock-in and steady revenues, etc., coming in here. So that was kind of basically really one example where it's really hard to see how these things can be docked. What I see also in the current economic climate is that the appetite to take big jumps is decreasing, right? It's rather play it safe, right? It's if we come back to that portfolio, maybe try to win an adjacent customer category, or use a new business model that acts as a service kind of thing for existing customers, and use technologies that are close to what the company already owns, right? To make it easier in here, right? So it's what I see is a refocusing of the blue shirt teams that you were asking for.
If I could just sort of paraphrase some of that back, the sort of notes I wrote down. So if we're meeting with executive, described incrementalism, et cetera, as I mentioned. So the first question we want to ask them, all right, for our blue shirt strategy, what's this time frame? Is it we want to get beyond 6 months? Great. But is it 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, something longer? That's one thing. You mentioned tying it to how can we tie our strategy to our current capabilities? And then you came back around to that. What I imagine is you mentioned this adjacency strategy. how can how can we manage the risk? How can we take one step and not just if we're building wings and we're going to just hang gliding thing, instead of just jumping off the mountain, maybe we jump 5 feet or something first. So pursuing an adjacency strategy. And you mentioned staying close to the technology, but I imagine that could also apply to distribution, where your brand plays, the distribution channels you have, that that also might be, but some basis of keeping some linkage to your strengths. And then the other thing you mentioned is like, what are the incentives? That might have been my word, so I might have been paraphrasing there. But you mentioned the financial, how we measure success, if it's completely measured in units shipped, or if it's completely measured in return on assets or something. We probably need some different metrics for our blue audience. Yes. And then I love this last one, just setting expectations, and that probably follows along with that incentives. That our return on assets for this blue business it's not the way to measure it for now. How well did I do with my summary of that? And for what we're going to do for our next year?
Very well. You're the Lean Scaleup of today, right?
Excellent.
But Scott, there's one more thing, a practical project experience.
Yeah.
So here's a truck company, right? One of the biggest globally, right? And they're currently, these are public figures, pulling in some 21% in service revenues, right? Which is predominantly coming from financial services, right? If you want to buy a car, you get it financed or get it leased or whatever, right? And they want to extend that service portion of their business to more than 50%. So basically also turning from a product company into a service company, if you will, right? So this is 8 years out, right? That 50% plus goal. Guess how much happens in advancing to that goal. And it's not that they are short of ideas, right? They've got also their innovation labs somewhere in Europe and then also in Silicon Valley. And they've got 3 or 4 of the things, corporate startups that could be turned into corporate scale-ups. But the company does not have anything set up, structure, funding, governance to enable that scaling up. So the answer to my rhetorical question a minute ago was 0.
Yeah.
Why? Because these long-term goals, these 8-year goals, do not fit with the red shirts horizons, the red shirts planning systems, the red shirts mind systems. Hey, they do not even fit with the senior management tenure, right? After 2-3 years, typically people change their job, isn't it, right? Yeah. So the art is in here, and this reinforces the points that you made, is to break down this 8-year journey into pieces that are digestible from the red shirt system, right? Say 12 to 18 months or so. You roadmap yourself into that future. And the roadmap could be on the channels, could be on the technology, could be on the customer groups. And this is how you then work in that blue shirt transformation goals into the red shirt target system.
Yeah, I think that's also a point why I so like that you need to establish a process. You need to have a process and a system because people come and go, but establishing a system that really then kind of runs I think that is absolutely key, because if you don't have that and the people change, that is something we experience quite often. There's great idea, a couple of people pushed it, they get an offer or a frustration or whatever, they change and poof.
Exactly.
The great bet that we wanted to kind of build our future on out the window as well, and that's just a shame. So I think that's why such a process is so important.
You need to bake it into the system, as I like to say, right? And also, Jan, even if the people stay the same, you have 2 bad quarters.
That's true.
That changes how people look at it. So you need to bake it into the system, right? Earmarked funding and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. There's one thing I want to dive into, because you mentioned it now twice, kind of in a what is it, Nebensatz? Well, like a tiny sentence on the side, where you say, well, there's never a shortage of ideas, and there is. I mean, I stole a couple of the things that how you talk about things, but one of the most important things I think that you bring to the table is this distinction between ideas, they can be good, can be bad, and meaningful ideas. So if you could talk a little bit about what a meaningful idea is, why is it so difficult to have one? I mean, I completely agree with the diagnostics. Let's say, like, I've yet to meet a company that doesn't have any ideas. Usually, and that's a problem you can solve easily. And you can sit down, you can write down 100 ideas. There you go. But now what? Like what? So how do you move from this ocean of ideas, many ideas, to something like a meaningful idea? And what is a meaningful idea?
You should know that, Jan. We had a webinar.
I know that's a
yeah, you probably know Wayne Gretzky, right? Probably the best ice hockey player ever, who ever did the sport on the planet. And when Wayne Gretzky was asked, what's the source of your success? He said, "Well, I'm not skating to where the puck is. I'm skating where the puck will going to be," right? And it's the same in innovation and in business building, right? We are shooting on a moving target, right? So it will take us 2, 3, 5 years to realize what we are up to, right? And in 2, 3, 5 years, the company will be different. The environment will be different. So this is what you need to be considering. How does what we are doing relate to the trajectory that the company is going to, right? Yeah. And so an idea is not just a fancy idea. It also needs to fit to the trajectory where the company would like to be in 3 to 5 years, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe this, so at one point, I mean, we are here all in this jobs to be done world, and that's how we connected. Mm-hmm. Where does the customer kind of come in? At what point do you need to validate with the customer, or maybe you can go into that a little bit before we kind of find our way to another topic?
When we look at what happens before scaling, Jan, the Lean Scaleup tells you, well, first you need to look, is it worthy to be scaled? Should we even think about it, right? Company trajectory, fit, and a lot of other things that need to be taken care of. And if it is worthy, is it ready to be scaled in here? In the first step, you do experiments with the market. In the second stage, you do experiments in market. So experiments with markets would be, for instance, that kind of A/B test, or the smoke door tests that you're doing, or the Wizard of Oz experiments, right? Where you collect the data that tell you, well, there might be something good out there, right? And then the second stage, when you do the experiments in market, you try to tweak and optimize your go-to-market approach, etc. And the thing that you start with is what I call a burning hair problem. So you have a customer who really has a problem, not just who should have, or that's an interesting option, or these kind of stuff, right? If I don't act now, if I don't act with determination, right? Further down the road, I might be going out of business. Yeah. And finding that burning hair problem is where I see the jobs to be done to be of extremely valuable help out there.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I think it's finding this point. I think it's finding this match of where does the company want to go? Like, what can we do? Where do we want to go? And then also, where is the customer? Like, where does it really hurt the customer? And if you find that kind of golden match, that's pretty good already as a start point to maybe, okay, there is something that's worthy to be scaled. Yeah. It even makes sense then to go to maybe raise that limitation on budget a little bit, right? So something like that. Okay, so I want to maybe so I think you made a distinction there that I just want to get into a little bit more in detail. Is the distinction between, well, there is pre-scaling, and then there's scaling. So you cannot just go in, have an idea, and scale. So if you could maybe talk about these different steps and what it takes, and how do you evaluate kind of progress of an idea, so that at one point we actually can scale it.
So first of all, I mean, if we, maybe it helps to think about people first, right? And it turns out, if we look at the end-to-end journey, which starts with meaningful search fields, where you find oceans of ideas and hopefully 3 or 4 meaningful ideas in here. And then you go through the validation, collecting the proof points. And once you find that you tick all the boxes, right, you delivered all of the proof points, you might say, now let's make it big, right? Let's invest a couple of millions in here, and let's really create a sizable, sustainable equals profitable business out of that. So it turns out you need to have 3 different sorts of people. And the first step in the search field to the meaningful idea, right, you need ethnographic people. So if we look at it, Jan, we need 3 different types of people. In the first step, meaning the search field to a meaningful idea, you need the ethnographs, right? The fly on the wall, right? That watches people, try to elicit what the jobs to be done, and how they measure the importance and the fulfillment, and really it's observation. It's getting the essence out of that without primarily the interviews, because we all know say and do, there's a chasm in between, right? In the second step, when you collect the proof points for a meaningful idea, you need to have scientists in here, right? With the scientific approach that we spoke about earlier, right? So what are the biggest assumptions? How can I test them? How can I validate them or falsify them? What do the data tell me in here? And scaling up is a third type of people, right? You cannot win the scaling up with ethnographs or with that scientific mindset. Scaling up is about building a parachute as you fall down, right? Is one of my clients, a leader of a corporate scale-up, once said to me, Frank, scaling up is as easy as riding a bicycle. And I looked at him and said, what are you talking about? And then he continued, but you have to know the bicycle is burning and everything else is burning as well, right? And it's really
super easy, basically.
And you try to stay alive, so to say, right? So you need to basically people that enjoy the action, getting things done, and learning stuff, and improving the go-to-market approaches, and basically getting closer as the scale-up grows to a kind of red shirt system, where you have processes, where you have systems, where you have people that know how to run that stuff. But you don't want to lose that startup spirit, right? Because your journey does not end when you crack the first 10 millions of annual in revenue, right? There might be something bigger out there. And so how do you measure progress? I think in the first step, you use what we call the meaningful idea canvas, right? Which consolidates crucial elements of the jobs to be done methodology with that corporate context and the perspective that is out there. So does it fit to the trajectory in here? An initial view on the competition, etc., and a sizable market that you're envisioning, that kind of stuff in here, right?
Yeah.
When the next step, when you do collect the proof points, well, it turns out, luckily for the corporate practitioner, that there is a body of knowledge emerging. And what you could do is you basically could lay out the scope of what you need to validate and put this over time in maturity stages, right? And if you're thinking even more advanced, as some of my clients have been done, they set up a business graduation scheme that starts with a meaningful search field, goes through the maturity stages over the in the validation, and then continues in scaling up. And there are some principles like metered funding, like lean governance, that really trigger that kind of entrepreneurial thinking. Now, what you do in the validation, if you have that 4 tracks, the scope, the content of the validation, and the 4 maturity stages, is you define deliverables in here. And to make it very clear what the deliverable will be, you say, these are the thinking tools you need to use, the canvases, the checklists, etc., you name it, to demonstrate that you've actually did your homework, and that you can put a green light on that bubble in here. So what you end up with is a kind of scorecard that will show you, well, this has been validated, and here are leaps of faith that you take. And to complete the picture, what you do then with the people, with the team, is you have an in-company but team external kind of auditor, if you will, that looks at the proof points that the team has provided, and he or she will then say the traffic light is amber or the traffic light is green. So this is how you can build up the progress monitoring in the pre-scaling phase, and then you go on in the scaling phase with defining adequate milestones as well.
Yeah, that's maybe that's just me, but when I saw you showing that scorecard in a talk that you gave, I knew I need to speak to that guy. Like that's I looked at it and I realized, okay, that's exactly how you should do it. That's exactly how you should do it. And you did all the necessary work of, there's a tech problem, there's a customer problem, there's a business model, like, and then there is a toolbox that you have in your approach for all of these different steps. And it's doable. It's hard work, but it's doable. But it so increases the chances from these 3%, I mean, which is basically not a chance at all. And that's just what it takes. So that's really what I encourage people to do. Go to it's www.leanscaleup.com, I think, where you can also find out more about Frank, about the book. And I think you can sign up still, right? To collaborate on the second edition.
Yes.
There is also these beautiful roundtables, I think, right? So for practitioners, where you can basically get people together, do those roundtable. Where else can people find out more about you or about the Lean Scale-Up approach?
Yeah, so for instance, beginning of May, I will be in Innovators Lisbon, and in June, I guess I will be at the Innovators in Amsterdam conference. So let's meet in one of those conferences. But I think the easiest way are these roundtables that Jan just mentioned. See, the problem, Jan, that we're addressing is, as we speak right now, there's not a textbook solution for corporate new business building, right? There's an emerging practice, I would call, which is codified in the Lean Scale-Up framework. But there's so many aspects in here where people practitioners feel the pain, where they really appreciate the opportunity to have a platform to speak with their peers about specific issues. Like, for instance, we touched upon the aligning now and new in the beginning of our conversation. So how could I nudge my C-suite to take action in here? That's a pain, right? Yeah. And it helps people from really great companies. I remember Roche, I remember SAP, I remember ABB in the last roundtable, to exchange views, to put their ideas to the test, and learn what works and what doesn't in these kind of settings. So this is not a webinar, but it's a discussion forum, right? Discussion started 10 minutes, and then it's peer-to-peer discussion. So go to leanscaleup.com, right? And there you'll find a link to the roundtables. Sign up, that's free, without any obligation.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Frank. Anything else you want to any other message you want to send out to the people out there?
Happy that you reached out after you saw me presenting that scorecard.
All right. So that concludes today's Product Quest podcast. Please send any comments or ideas for future shows to productquestpodcast@gmail.com. And of course, see you next time.
Blue shirts and the red shirts. They're always
the blue
fighting along.
Thanks, Frank.
Well, it was a great show. It was very